are on lesson 4 of our Revelation Part 3 study. We, for the first time in weeks, if you take in consideration all of Part 2, which was completely contained within the book of Revelation, this is the first week that we've been outside the book of Revelation in the book of Matthew. But as Sandy was just saying right before we started this video, all of what we're learning, and including this week's lesson, is interesting in light of what's going on today. And we are in just October 1st of 2015, and it just seems like the world's collapsing right in front of us, or at least America. I pray that that's not true. I pray that we held on. I don't want to see the demise of our country, but we certainly are following a pattern of collapse and judgment. So anyway, how many of y'all got to see the blood moon? I got to see the moon. It was too cloudy. I went, it was right out here. I was trying to take pictures. At one point there was a break in the clouds and I got to see the moon when it was pretty full, you know, before actually the eclipse started happening. But by the time, not long after that, the cloud cover was so much, but I could actually see a glow through the clouds when it was red, but I couldn't have been able to tell you it was a blood moon. But I've seen some of the pictures that people have posted on Facebook about it. It was beautiful. And many in the debate about what did that mean? You know, what is that pointing to? What is the sign of that? And it didn't, there's no, number one, there is nothing prophetic that needs to happen between now and whenever the events that we're studying have to happen. Do you realize that? There's nothing to prevent any of it from being kicked off. But once the clock starts ticking, once the events begin to happen, they will follow the pattern that is set. So how does that make us live? That is the question that's been on my mind, especially starting last week, is not so what, like so what, but in light of all this, in light of what we're studying, what is that, what does it cause? It's causing me, I don't know if it's causing you, to stop and go, whatever I'm doing, does this even matter? Should I be occupied by this? What should I be doing? That doesn't mean that I should be necessarily on my knees 24 hours or take away 8 for sleep, you know, that I should constantly be just reading this or always and ever closing my eyes and on my knees in that posture of prayer. That wouldn't be a bad thing if that's what God called me to do. But we're supposed to be living, aren't we? How are we taking this into my life? How am I taking it into my life? And as I'm taking it into my life, how is it coming out of me to others? What's that?
Yeah, just be kinder to people.
Sure, absolutely. Because does stuff matter or do people matter? Sorry.
You want to take as many with you as you can.
Yes, yes. And we talked about that here last week. That when we were, and I'm going to here because I had the lake of fire down here on my board. But who do we want there? We want no one there. Actually, I want the beast and false prophet there. Yeah. I want Satan there. And his angels, right. But as far as anybody I know or anybody I don't even know, I'm not wanting to send them there. But in the justice of God issue, yes, I want who should be there. I mean, I'm not trying to outmercy God. But how do we live? Yes, we are kinder to people. But in the kindness towards people, the kindest thing that we can do,
Just tell them about Jesus.
tell them about Jesus. Tell them the truth. And in telling them about Jesus, it's warning them, telling them the truth about what we're learning, right? Okay, so let's get into what we're learning. We've looked at Revelation. We're going to try to put some of what we're learning about Matthew into the context of what we've learned about Revelation. And I'm debating, do I go ahead and put a timeline up here? But let's just think about it, because I need to use my board for a chart, sort of. So as we think through, and as we've established through our study of Part 2, and then in these first 3 weeks of Part 3, where we were doing a review or overview for people who haven't done the study before and looking at Revelation, there is a key pivotal point that we have defined on our timeline that's described for us in the book of Revelation? What is that key pivotal point that we can start nailing down and events either come before it or after it and pertain to it? What is that point? Do you remember?
The 1,260 days.
There's 1,260 days.
The middle.
The middle, okay, so,
Goes this way and then
yeah,
goes this way.
Sandy's doing this. Okay, so now I'm going the key little point, okay. So there is a midpoint or a point on our timeline. And there's events that happen before it a certain number of days, like 1,260 days. And there's events that come after it a certain number of days, 42 months, 1,260 days, time, times, and half a time. Remember all those time phrases? What is that point?
The end of the sixth seal?
The end of the sixth trumpet at the beginning of the seventh, right? So right at the beginning of the seventh trumpet or the end of the sixth trumpet, yes. So we have, that helps us, we've got the seals, we have the trumpets, and we have the bowls, right? So as we do the 7 seals and then we have the 6th up to the 7th trumpet, that's that pivotal point, right? There are things happening at that point. We saw in chapter 11 the end of what that happens at that point? The end of the testimony of the 2 witnesses, right? And that's their 1,260 days. So we know from that pivotal point backwards, their testimony goes 1,260 days. We don't know how the seals and the first 6 trumpets fit in necessarily to that 1,260 days. We just know, as a result, since at that point the 2 witnesses are killed by who? By whom? Who are they killed by? Whom? The beast. Beast that comes out of the abyss. Right. So that's what chapter 11 tells us. So we know from that the beast is on the scene during that time. We know there's a beast. We know he's on the scene during part of, at least, up to the end of their testimony. Okay. He's an adult. So if it's 1,260 days, which is 3.5 years, then he's already born during that time. He's been born prior to that 1,260 days, because he wouldn't have, it wouldn't be an infant that was doing this. Okay, and coming out of the abyss, we believe indicates what?
That he died and came back.
He died, he came back from the dead, right, so he had to have died. So we know in the events that are described in chapter 13 about the beast, the 2 beasts, the first beast and the second beast, it tells us of the first beast, he has a fatal wound that was
Deadly.
healed. It was deadly, and he was healed from it. That might be that event that we're talking about, and the reason he's coming out of the abyss in order to kill the 2 witnesses. Or he has at some point come out of the abyss. We know that fatal wound was caused by what kind of weapon? A sword, right, and that's all in chapter 13. Okay, so that pivotal point is here, 1,260 days, goes backward from that point because the 2 witnesses die, and then they ascend to heaven, right? And in chapter 12, we saw an event that is also tied to that pivotal point. We saw something happening in heaven. A war in heaven between Michael and his angels and Satan, or the dragon, which we know is Satan and the devil and all that. We know that from chapter 12. There is a war in heaven. As a result of that war, who loses? Satan. And what happens? He's thrown to the earth. So at that point, he's thrown to the earth. And from that point forward, this direction, we know some times start happening. One is in chapter 12.
Mark.
Not yet, that's in 13. In chapter 12, we see the 2 signs. We have the dragon. Who's the other sign? The woman, right? And the woman we know is Israel. And the woman who is Israel, because Satan is cast down to the earth, what does she go? She flees to the wilderness for that 3.5 years, or I think the other time phrase, or it says time, times, and half a time, and I think the other is 1,260 days. I try to get those time phrases accurate. Okay, so she flees. During this time, he has gone off to persecute her. He did try. She flees. She's cared for in a place that God provided. Okay, now that's on, you kind of see a faint line here. That's not the pivotal point on that side. But also in chapter 13, we see the dragon watching the beast come out of the water, come out of the sea. And what does the dragon do for the beast? Gives him his throne and his authority, his power, for how long? I think it's 42 months in that case, but it's 3.5 years again. same time frame that the woman is fleeing and held. Okay. Now, we go forward, so that is very pivotal. And as we look at Matthew 24, we're going to try, 23 and 24, we're going to try to see, does any of this fit? And where does it fit, if we can? We're going to put ourselves into context, starting in chapter 23. Who is the person narrating this? Who's talking? Jesus. How do we know that? If you didn't find it out soon enough, you can go back a little further in 23. I'm sorry?
It says,
Verse 1.
Verse 1 tells us, right. Right. And so Jesus is speaking primarily in this. No, there's other voices because the disciples asking questions, but it's Jesus speaking. All right. So do you know what events that we can name? We have our own celebration of these events. Do you know when this falls in Jesus' ministry? Did you go back far enough? I had to go back, flip a few pages. Far enough.
It's before the tribulation.
Well, we're talking about Jesus speaking in the time that he's speaking.
Oh.
Not the events he's talking about, but you're right about that. I'm sorry, Jackie. The last week prior to his crucifixion, right? What major event happened before this?
Palm Sunday.
Palm Sunday. What we call Palm Sunday, we might call it the triumphal entry, right? Okay, so we know the triumphal entry, and in the time we celebrate it as Palm Sunday in our calendar, right? So that happened on what day of the week? It's Sunday. And it was a Sunday then too, by the way. The first day of the week. We know the event. We know that Jesus was on a donkey. We know they laid down palms. We know they raised palms and said, Hosanna, right? And he was coming in. We know the events of how they got the donkey and all of that. So Jesus comes into Jerusalem in that final week, right? So that's on Sunday. What he did during that week prior to his arrest and his trial and all of that is what? Do you know what he did during those first few days of the week?
He's talking to the multitude.
Talking to the multitudes where? We're going to be real literal here. In Jerusalem, right? And especially and specifically where? At the temple, primarily. Okay, so when we have Jesus right here in this moment, where is he? If we were to put a dot on a map, where is Jesus speaking this? In the temple in 23 and right outside the temple in 24, right? Okay, what does that tell you existed when Jesus was telling this? There was a temple, right? Okay, so you got to put all that context in there because this is hugely significant what he says. Okay, so at the end of 23, we have like two paragraphs starting in 29 going to 36, and then 37 through 39 is a separate paragraph. So if you kind of look at what is Jesus saying there and what is Jesus saying there, it's all part of one discourse. It's not even the start of the discourse, but he's talking. Who's he talking to when he starts out in 29?
The prophets and the scribes.
He's talking to the scribes and the Pharisees,
Pharisees.
and he's calling them hypocrites. And he says the first word is
Whoa.
whoa. Okay. When we say whoa for a lot of reasons. Like whoa, like we're like pulling in a horse. You know, whoa is really kind of how we're using that. But that's not the word used here. This word whoa is this is not good. This is really not good. And when Jesus says it, okay, and I can look, because I've marked it, 25 he starts with woe, 27 he starts with woe, 29 he starts with woe, 23 if you go back, 16, 15, 14, 13. I've got it marked. I can just glance down my page. It's woe, woe. So when he's saying, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, who is saying this? Jesus. Is this the way that we tend to portray Jesus speaking to people? No, but this is truth, isn't it? And it happened in that time, and he's talking to that group. Hypocrite is in the Greek is the idea or word for actor. An actor. And in those times, in their Greek theaters, they would put up masks that would portray a face. You've probably seen them sometimes, you know, like masquerade type, right? Like they would not be on a stick or something. They would put on a mask so that audience could understand their expressions. You know, like we use emoticons as they're called in emotion icons, emoticons. In our texting, in our Facebook posts and everything, you can go and there's smiley faces, there's crying faces, there's dogs, cats, all kinds of things. But if you pick one of those, you're expressing an emotion, aren't you? It's an icon for an emotion, emoticons, okay? In a similar way, they would have a mask. That mask would be scowling. That mask would be smiling. That mask could be whatever. But it was still a mask that covered the face and expressed something the person behind the mask wasn't necessarily feeling. That's the idea. I'm putting up a face. And it's very convicting to think about, is that what we do in life? And is that what we do when we go to church, for instance, specifically? Do we put on church and act a certain way when we're there? I'm not saying any of y'all necessarily do that, but I think we're all capable of it and have, you know, and think about it. And there's others that do it to a degree that Jesus would say to them, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. For you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn monuments of the righteous, and say, if I had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in the shedding of the blood of the prophets. Consequently, you bear witness against yourselves, and you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers, you serpents, you brood of vipers. How shall you escape the sentence of hell? And we go on. But I want you to just think about Jesus standing there. He's in Jerusalem. This is the final week. He knows that. The people listening don't necessarily know. They know their plans. They know their conspiracies. But they don't know what's happening a few days from now, a few days from this event, this time. He does. So if you were Jesus, how important would be every word you said? Throughout his life, every word would have been important. That last week, how important would your words be? Right? And like I said earlier, how should we be living now?
The same way.
Yeah. We're in those times. This might be the last opportunity, if you're talking to somebody, that you ever have to talk to that person. I mean, the event I'm waiting for is awesome. It's awesome. But the people I might leave behind, I would, if I had that moment of saying, I know in just a second, let me say one more thing to you. What would that thing be? That's how we need to be living. Jesus was saying these words. So he didn't just sit there and say, you serpents, you brood of vipers, how shall you escape the sentence of death, sentence of hell? And I don't know that he was vicious and nasty, but he would have been serious.
His voice was loud.
You're right, it carried. They would have heard him. It would have been penetrating. Yeah, and his eyes would have been penetrating, right. I just got to think, I would have been just cut, feeling like I was cut to the quick. And he says, I am sending you the prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill. So he's talking about future. And crucify. That word just really popped off the page at me, because when we read crucify, we know the event. We know the significant crucifixion that's coming. It hadn't happened yet. This is a word that in their culture they wouldn't even say, because it was such a horrible thing. They wouldn't discuss it because it was such a horrible thing. And Jesus, they did obviously discuss it some, but Jesus is saying, you're going to kill some of them. You're going to crucify some of them. You're going to scourge them and some of them you scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that upon you may fall the guilt of the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel. Okay, where does that take you, your mind? Genesis. Who is Abel?
First person ever murdered.
First person ever killed. And he didn't just die, he was murdered, right? So from the first blood ever let of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, however you pronounce that, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Don't get stuck on that. I have no idea. Just move on. It was apparently somebody that was killed. But what is he doing? He's saying from the very first blood all the way up to present day and future to you, because you're going to do more, I'm holding you guilty for all of that. And it's because they're saying we're so much better than the ones who did that before. We would never do that. He knows what they're going to do, but he's also judging them for their judgment, which is why we're warned not to do that. It's not that we don't say, this is sin, you're committing sin. That's not what not judging is talking about. It's saying, don't judge somebody without understanding that you're capable of it too. Because in judging someone else, especially if you're doing it, something similar. I had a recent experience where somebody just got so righteously indignant because somebody lied to him. And this was a person who lied constantly. Seriously, every time he breathed, he lied. And I remember when he said it, I just went, you have a problem with lying? And he goes, yes, I've got a biblical worldview. I said, so you're saying that with your biblical worldview that lying is opposed to God and God's ways? I was trying to think of the words as I was saying them. And he goes, yes. And every person in the room that heard him say it knew he lied about almost everything. So how does God view someone who condemns someone else for doing the thing they're doing? It's a problem. And for us, it's a caution. It's not that we never say anything. It's that in saying it, if you're even talking to somebody, you say, I'm capable of it too. Or I've done, maybe not exactly that thing, but I've done other things. You don't have to tell them everything that they could use against you, but you can tell them enough. We don't stand in judgment because we're perfect.
You never know until you're in that situation,
Yes.
what you would do.
That is the other, is you don't know what words are going to come out of your mouth. You don't know. I've told people grieve differently, so don't judge someone's grief. Now, I'm capable of judging someone's grief. I mean, but everybody needs to grieve differently. You don't know what they're going through. You don't know what is behind that.
Is that what it means? But for grace, there goes I?
Yeah.
Is that what it means?
Yeah. That's how I would use it.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a biblical phrase as far as I can't point to a verse that says that phrase, but we do say that. But thereby before, but wait a minute. The way we use the phrase is, there but by the grace of God go I. In other words, if it hadn't been for the grace of God, I would be right where that person is. Or I was where they were, but by the grace of God, I'm not there anymore. And again, it's not a judgment. It's not a condemnation of someone else. It's just a realization. So you've got Jesus talking to that group, context of time, and now he says, starts in 37, well, he's telling them, I'm going to lay at your feet all the guilt for all that blood. And then he says, truly I say to you, all these things shall come upon this generation. And this is a phrase, or similar phrase that we hear again, right? Have you heard this before? Okay. It was one of those, if you have your list at the end of this lesson where it said, do you have any questions? That was one that went on my list of questions. I don't know if it did for you, but it did for me. Okay, good. So if he's saying it to this group of people and he's saying, all these things shall come upon this generation, he's talking about what things? This is a kind of a concluding statement. He's talking about what he just talked about. The guilt, the things. Okay, not what's coming, but what he just talked about, possibly. Okay, now in 37 through 39, Jesus does what? What does he say? Who's he speaking to?
People in Jerusalem?
Yeah. He's saying Jerusalem, which is a city, but obviously he's talking about the people of Jerusalem. And he says, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Okay, I'm just calling words. I could put emotion in this. Jesus didn't just sit there and go, oh, Jerusalem. Or he didn't just say, I think this is like a cry from his soul. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Who kills the prophets and stones that were sent to her. How often I've wanted to gather. I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. There's a Facebook picture that just came out of a bird on a limb with the chicks under, the whatever, little birdies underneath. Or you might have heard the story, and Kay might even say it in this video, because I've heard her say it before, of a man who walks through a field, you know, like in the plain states where the prairie fires come and burn up whole crops, burn up whole fields. And this man was walking afterwards through one of those fields, and he looks down and his foot kicks, and it turns out it's a mother bird, the carcass and wing spread of a mother bird, and when he kicks it, the babies are alive underneath this burned, dead carcass. That's what Jesus is talking about. Not that he's the burned, dead carcass, but the idea of protection. I wanted to protect you. I wanted to come. I wanted to gather you close. Or Jesus, throughout Scripture, you see this picture of being under the wings of God up against him. That's how he gathers us. We get to come under the wings of God, whether he has wings or not. It's the idea of that we're right up against his heart.
That's how I feel about it today.
Okay.
And he's trying to gather us, but there's so many people unwilling.
Yes, the unwilling part is cutting,
That's
isn't it?
what's worrying.
Yes. Jesus still wants to gather people. Jesus still wants to spread his wings of protection, and people want to be out there. They're rejecting him, yes. And then it says, behold, your house is being left to you desolate. What house is he talking about? The temple, right? He says, behold, your house is being left to you desolate. Desolate is not a mild word. Desolate has in it what ideas? How would you describe it? Barren, destroyed, just nothing. Yeah, bereft, completely rid of anything good, right? Your house, your temple is being left to you desolate. And then he says, for I say to you, from now on you will not see my face until I say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So at what point is this in that week? Right before these major events are coming, right? The last time he's in the temple. When he walks out, what did he just do? When God was in the building. Remember, we have that stupid phrase, Elvis is in the building, or left the building. Okay, so you've got Jesus, God, whether they recognize it or not, is in the holy place, in the temple, not inside the Holy of Holies, but he's in the temple. And he walks out.
And it becomes desolate.
And that's what makes it desolate. For 3.5 years, God dwelled among them in human bodily form. At 8 days old, God was brought into the temple for the first time since the days of Daniel. Think about that. The Shekinah glory left the temple. Ezekiel describes it. The Shekinah glory, the presence, the visible presence of God that was in the temple. That when Solomon prayed and the temple was dedicated, that time, not that because he did it, but when Solomon was praying and the temple was dedicated, the glory of God filled the temple and drove all the priests out. Nobody could be inside it. That visible presence of God stayed over the temple. From that dedication by Solomon to when Daniel, the times of Daniel, when Ezekiel and Jeremiah, those prophets, watched Babylon come and take in 3 sieges Jerusalem. At one point, the Shekinah glory left. But then some people came back. Nehemiah, Ezra, those chapters, historic books. And they built up the temple again. And then later, Herod enhanced it, but it was still one structure. But Herod enhanced it. Shekinah glory never came back. So from the time that it left, God left the building in the days of Daniel, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, to the time of Jesus as an 8-day-old baby And who got to see that? Who, when he was brought to the temple by Mary and Joseph, they got to see it. But who recognized it and acknowledged what had just been brought back into the building? Yeah, was it Anna and what was the guy's name?
Oh, gosh, it took my.
It was
Yeah.
an old couple,
Well, what a couple, it was two, it was a man and a woman, but not a couple.
but they were older.
But yes, an older man, and he had been told
He would live.
he would live until he saw Messiah, right? And then Anna, I think is her name, an old prophetess that lived in the temple, recognized Jesus for who he was. What a blessing that would have been. But so Jesus, during that time, he came back when he was 12 at least, maybe more, but he came back, remember? And he stayed behind and he said, I must be about my Father's business when his parents found him again. And then during this 3.5-year ministry that we're seeing the end of that 3.5 years in this point in time. So it's so, can you imagine how significant those 2 paragraphs we just went over are? And then he walks out, right? He came out from the temple, starting in verse 1 at 24. And he was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. These were pretty significant buildings. These were beautiful and very significant to them as a people. And Jesus answered and said to them, do you not see all these things, all these buildings? I say to you, what? Not one stone shall be left upon another, which will not be torn down. And just think about, let's say, our Capitol building, still standing in Washington. If I were to sit here with true knowledge, which I don't have, I'm not a prophet, I can't tell you, but if I were to sit here and say, look at all these buildings, look at the Capitol building, look at the White House, look at Washington's monument, look at Lincoln Memorial and now the World War II monument, I think it is 2, not 1, and then you've got I'm sorry, I'm putting them in place if you've ever been in DC, over next to Lincoln's Memorial, you've got the Vietnam, thank you, Memorial Wall, and then you've got Jefferson's Monument over here, and you've got the mall, which is that lawn, but you've got all those buildings up and down. If we were standing out there and I went, look at all these buildings. Look at all these buildings. See that Capitol building? Not one stone is to be left upon another. We can imagine a building being destroyed, but we really can't imagine, they couldn't imagine that God was going to allow the temple to be destroyed. Or didn't want to imagine it. Okay. Now, as we go through 24, we need to start putting some information up on the board because we want to start seeing. And you went through it and you went through it. She gave you 5 days of going over this and going over this. Did you start seeing some patterns in how it was laid out? Start seeing some ideas? Like, did you divide things up? Did some things that weren't so obvious start coming to the surface? That's the process of inductive study. It took really for me when on day 5 we started listing the events, and I went right along, and started listing all those events and trying to put things in place and everything else. And then I got to the end of chapter 24, verse 14, and I had a problem because 15 comes after 14. Well, what's the last thing told in verse 14? What's it? The end. The end will come, right? Boom. Stop my timeline. Stop my list of events. How do you then go from 15 on? Is 15 on a continuation after 14 on a timeline of a list of events? Not hearing answers.
We're confused.
Okay, so let's reason together. Let's think about this. Let's go back for a second to when Jesus says, not one stone will be left on the other. And then he's sitting on the Mount of Olives, which apparently have not been there. I think it's to the east of the city, and so you can sit there and look back on the temple area. So basically this is a high place where you could look at these structures that he's just talked about, that they've just walked away from. And what is asked of him?
When these things shall be.
Okay.
What is the sign?
When will these things be? What is
will
this?
happen?
When will these things be? What is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Okay? So, if you were to list that, is that one question? Is that 2 questions? Is that 3 questions? It's one sentence with one question mark.
There's a comma and an and, so comma and an and.
Okay, comma and, she's going grammatical on us, that's great. Okay, so the comma and the and sets what apart?
Another question.
Another question, are you, okay, so you're separating it into essentially two questions. Ann said the same, two questions. This is not a survey and we're not gonna have a democratic vote. We're just looking at, okay, so it seems like they're asking him, when will these things be? And what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age, right? It sounds like that's its own question. Okay, what's the course title that we're in part 3?
Oh,
What is the sign of his coming and of the end of the age? Okay, so we're gonna finish and answer everything today and you're done. You don't have to do the rap joke. But this is where it's being brought up. It's really important because in future lessons, we're going to see what seems to be a parallel passage to this. I really want us to think about what's being asked here. Jesus had just been in the temple, had just said that about the scribes and the Pharisees, had just said that about Jerusalem. I would gather you like hen. I'm leaving your house desolate. Walks outside and says, they were pointing out the buildings, and he said, not one stone will be left on the other. So when they ask the question, when will these things be? What do you think they're asking?
When will the temple be torn down?
Essentially, the immediate would be, when will there not be one stone left on another? When will that be? Could be also, when will you leave the house desolate? Could be some more, but at least the immediate context is, you just said there's not going to be one stone left on another. When's that going to happen? Okay? The next question, though, is, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, we like that they asked that question, but I really want to, again, put you back into time being those people. They had yet to see the crucifixion. They had yet to really believe it was going to happen, even though he kept telling them in prior that it was going to. They're thinking Messiah is going to come and save us all and get rid of this horrible, awful oppressor that the immediate circumstance has over us, Rome, right? So they thought, in a very short myopic view, which we tend to have, that that's what he's here for. So they're asking a question that's very interesting. What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? What do they think and hope is going to happen as a result of him coming in at the end of the age?
He'd be the king.
He'd be the king, because that's what they know prophetically is going to happen. We know that's going to happen, right? But they think it's going to happen now, or has already started, whatever. That's part of the devastation they felt when he was killed, when he was crucified. Because they didn't know about 3 days later. Okay, and then it says, Jesus said to them what?
Beware of false prophets.
Yes. Well, first he says, he talks about false prophets later, but here it's like, see that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. Okay, so we're going to divide our time into, and we'll just say these things, because there's a question. And we could say when. When will these things be? And then also, when is the sign? And you can ... You can put as much of the verbiage. And I would suggest you do. I'm just trying to be brief. But what is the sign? Sorry, what is the sign? Not when. What is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So we're going to kind of look at those two things and see if and how Jesus answers those questions. Okay? But the first thing we see is that he gives them what? A warning, right? Or it's definitely a warning, but we're just going to call them instructions because it is an instruction, right? But it comes in the way of warning. So what does he tell them to do?
So don't be misled.
Right. And then we're going to also look at kind of events or what's going to happen. And we're going to look at that for both. What are the instructions, or what does he tell them to do? And we're going to look at what happens. Okay. So first he's told them, don't be misled. And what are they gonna be misled by? What's the next verse talking about?
People saying that that they are Christ.
Right, there's gonna be people come in his name saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead, okay? So he's telling them, don't be misled by
False prophet.
false Christs,
False prophet.
okay? Have we seen this in our lifetime? We can name names, can't we? Right? Not in Jerusalem, but we know of, can y'all name a couple?
Jim Jones.
Bob Jones? No, not Bob Jones.
Jim
Jim Jones, sorry, Bob Jones. Jim Jones.
Who was the guy in Waco?
David Koresh. Okay, we can name those two, right? Because they actually said that they were Christ, they were Jesus. Okay. But there are going to be many come saying,
Charles Manson, for that matter.
okay, right, there's many, yeah, it's Charles Manson, that's just a scary one. Okay, well, what are going to be some of the events? What does he say is going to happen?
There's going to be hearings of wars and rumors of wars.
There's going to be war, yeah, hearings of wars and rumors of wars, and then he says,
Don't be frightened.
don't be frightened, or see that you're not, but we're going to say, don't be frightened. And these wars and rumors of wars and the other things that he talks about here, he puts under a category at the very end of what? What does he call them? Right, the beginning, does it say the beginnings of?
Yes.
Okay, but I'm just, so it's the beginnings of, but I'm just going to say birth pangs. Okay, and so under that you can say wars and rumors of wars, right? What else?
Famine.
Is there going to be famine? Okay. What else?
Nation against nation.
Okay, nation against nation.
Earthquakes.
Earthquakes.
Mhm.
What else?
Then they will deliver you to tribulation.
Okay, well, then at the end of, but all these things are merely birth pangs.
Right.
Okay, so that kind of all comes under the category of birth pangs, and then it says what? You're going to be what? It's like the next thing. They're going to deliver you to,
Tribulation.
right. So now you've got delivered to tribulation. Okay, and under that delivered to tribulation, how is it described?
Killing you and be hated by all nations.
Okay, so you're going to be killed and hated by all nations. Anything else?
Because of his name.
Okay.
Many will fall away.
Okay. Yeah, and because of his name is really important, but now we'll get the next one. Because of his name. And then what was next, Cindy?
Fall away. I said fall.
Okay, so you've got those that are, many will fall away.
We're talking about Christians.
Well, that's the question, so hang on.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's a very good one, so if you had it on your list, that's good. What else? There, many will fall away and will do what?
Betray one another and hate one another.
Okay, so they'll deliver up one another. So that's the betrayal you're talking about, and hatred, right? And hate. Deliver one another and hate.
Lawlessness will increase.
Okay, because lawlessness, right. So lawlessness increases, and
False prophets will rise and mislead them.
so there's false prophets that arise and mislead. And because lawlessness increase, most people's love will grow cold. But then it says in verse 13, what does it say?
The one who endures shall be saved.
Okay, so if you endure to the end, you'll be saved. And then what does it say in 14?
Gospel shall be preached.
Right.
To the whole world.
Gospel preached
And
The
then
whole
the
world.
end will come.
Right. And then the end, right? Okay. So we have, I got squeezed down there, but we have all these events that are happening, okay? And then we've got the end. Now they've asked the question, when will these things be? Is that answering the question of when these things will be? Like the things of the temple being, did he answer that question? Not really. He didn't answer the question of when will the stones not be upon each other? But he still answered the question. What basically he's giving you an overview from those verses of what's going to happen, right? All the way to the end. And he says, don't be misled by false Christs. And now we can say false prophets also. And don't be frightened. If I, again, sat there in that mall outside the Capitol and said no stone's going to be left upon another, and then I started listing all these events, but I prefaced it with, don't be frightened. Would you be frightened? Yeah. But he's telling them not to be frightened. Why? You can endure to the end, right? And if you endure to the end, you'll be saved. But he's telling them in advance. So there's more to this story, starting in chapter 15, verse 15, moving on, because he's already told them about all of this to the end. Starting in verse 15, he starts talking about something else, right? What does he start talking about there? Okay. And at this point, you start seeing when, then. You start seeing a succession of events, don't you? Okay. So the two major events you see here are what? Over the rest of the chapter. Not the rest of the chapter, I'm sorry. These events are talked about through verse 31. There's two big markers, two big events. What are they? We've already mentioned the first one.
The great tribulation.
What? Okay, you got I'm sorry, there's three. Abomination of desolation, great tribulation, and then what?
The coming of the
Cunning of the Son of Man. Okay, so we're going to look at the abomination of desolation. Yeah. And that next thing that we're going to talk about is the Great Tribulation. The last thing we're going to talk about is the coming of the Son of Man. Does that answer a question that was asked?
Yes.
What is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age, right?
It answers, but they don't understand.
Well, of course they don't understand, but the information's there. Okay. When he says, when you see the abomination of desolation, what does he tell us about it?
Daniel.
Where did they hear it first?
From Daniel.
Yeah, spoken by Daniel, the prophet. Okay, just for a second, there are people that do not believe the book of Daniel. They don't believe that it was written by or about this man named Daniel. They believe it was basically made up for instruction, good instruction for young Jewish boys. They believe there's no way that Daniel could have written and known what he knew in advance. He couldn't have prophesied, right? Because it was so accurate. Isn't that amazing? It was so accurate, it can't be true. So they made it up after. It was written, decades or hundreds of years after Daniel, is what many believe. Who just referenced the book of Daniel?
Jesus.
What did that just do to the entire book of Daniel? Made it true. If you needed a reason, which I don't think y'all did, but if somebody ever says that, go back to here and say, put it in your flyleaf if you need to, so you can refer back to it and say, Jesus just confirmed the whole book of Daniel, but especially this prophecy. Because we've done the study on Daniel. If you've ever even read it, you know this phrase, the abomination of desolation. Okay? We're going to have time in future lessons to really, really go, because anyway, I don't want to get ahead of you. But the abomination of desolation, I could camp out on that for a long time. Not that I love the abomination of desolation, I just love the teaching that can come from it if you know what the Word of God says. And that's what's so important about what we do. Okay, so Daniel spoke about it, and it says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing, where? Okay, so it's going to be standing in the holy place. Does anybody know what the holy place is? It's the temple, but specifically what part of the temple? The Holy of Holies. Or at least inside the building, because there's the courtyard, but then there's the structure, or it used to be the tabernacle. But that inner part is the holy place, where they had it could be the part also that was where the table of showbread and the lamp and the altar of incense was before the veil, and behind the veil is the Holy of Holies. But sometimes all of that was called the holy place, and sometimes only the Holy of Holies. So in there, what's going to be there? Standing, well, that's where the Ark of the Covenant should be, but standing in the Holy of Holies is abomination of desolation. We've already talked about the word desolate. What's an abomination? I see the looks on your faces. Yeah, I mean, that's good, because it's horrible, it's completely against the way God would want it. Nasty, horrible, awful, about as bad as you can get. After you add on top of it the word desolation. And remember, Jesus has already said when he walked out of the temple, I'm leaving your house desolate. Here's another desolation that Jesus is talking about. Okay? He says, when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, right? Mm-hmm. So those in Judea is supposed to flee. There's more information given, like pray that it's not in winter. Why would he say that?
Cold.
It's cold, snow possible, bad weather, horrible conditions for travel, and they're supposed to flee. Flee where? To high ground.
Well, there's more snow.
Yeah, those of you who live in Tellico Plains know it's worse there than it is down here when it snows, right? And I'm in kind of the valley, but still close to the mountains. But it's colder and worse conditions in the mountains. And going into mountains is not easy terrain, is it? Okay, so unless you have four-wheel drive. Or a goat.
It still can be hard.
Right, and then it can still be hard. But they're told to flee to the mountains, and it says,
Or on the Sabbath.
yeah, it's bad that if it's on the Sabbath. It's also bad if you were pregnant or nursing. Okay, now, it's interesting, and I put some of these things in my questions, like, why would he have said that, you know? But you have to look at it. What he's describing is this is not going to be easy, this is going to be hard, and you got to do it. Because he says, let those on the rooftops do what? Don't turn back and get anything. Run.
And it says don't go get your coat, but if it's winter, you're not even supposed to stop and get your coat.
Right. You're not supposed to go back for anything. Kind of like when Lot and his family were told to not turn and look. Right? Don't turn back. Don't look back. Don't go for things that don't matter. So the urgency.
It's going to happen quickly.
Yes. And as soon as it happens, they are to run. They're to run. Okay. So when it says flee to the mountains, and it's talking about Judea, and it's talking about this event, abomination of desolation, when you see that, run. Does that remind you of anything in the book of Revelation? An event.
The fleeing.
The woman fleeing to the wilderness, right? Kind of reminds you of that, doesn't it? Could this be the event that kicks that off? Could we tie this to our pivotal time? Possibly, right? Okay. What happens after, he's telling us, in verse 21, for what? There will be a great tribulation, right? What does he tell us about the great tribulation? Or he says a great tribulation, sorry.
Nobody has ever seen anything like this or never.
Never before. You can write whatever you want through there. Never before has there been anything like this, and there won't be anything ever like it. This is a unique, horrific event, right? Tribulation's not a good word again. It's just not a good word. Okay, great tribulation, such has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever shall. Now, if you were a Jewish person and you knew the history and heritage of the Jews, can you name some pretty bad events? The Holocaust being a very recent one, right? Can you imagine an event, a time that's going to be worse than that? Well, you need to. How about when in the days of Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel, in those 3 sieges. They went for years under siege without food. Do you know what they did because it was so bad? They ate people. They ate their own children. They ate their own dung. Can you imagine something worse than that? You need to. Because it's going to be worse than that. Great tribulation, a great tribulation, such as never occurred, never will again, unless those days had been cut short. What does it say?
No
one would have been saved. But for whose sake?
The elect.
Right. For the sake of the elect. Those days are cut short, right? This is a bad, bad, bad time. But it's because of the elect, God cuts those days short. It's going to be a shorter period of time. It's not going to be a long, long period of time. It's going to be a short period of time. What does that make you think of? 3.5 years possibly, right? And what was, when Satan was cast to the earth, and he was full of rage and wrath, what did he know he only had? Short time. Okay, and with his goal in mind, and with his rage and his wrath, and he's just been kicked out of heaven, completely lost that battle that apparently thought he was going to win. He has that wrath and he goes after the woman. We saw that in chapter 12 of Revelation, right? And he turns that wrath onto the woman. And then when the earth literally helps her and God provides a place for her for protection, he turns and goes after the rest of her offspring, it says in chapter 12, who hold to the testimony of Jesus. Mm-hmm. Remember back here where it said, because of, where did I put it? Because of my name, you'll be hated. Only believers are persecuted because of Jesus' name. Right? Okay. So it says, the days will be cut short except for the sake of the elect. And it says in this, if anyone says, here's the Christ, there he is, what are you supposed to do? Okay, so you're not, it says, don't believe. Here is the Christ. Don't believe it when somebody says that. What else do they say?
The false Christ and false prophets will do signs and wonders.
Okay, so what are they to do? You got false Christs and false prophets who perform signs and wonders. Okay, do you remember someone described in the book of Revelation that did perform signs and wonders? Do you remember who it was? The second beast. Yes, you're right about the beast, but it's the second beast. And remember last week when we finally got through the book again, and we saw that there's 2 at the end of chapter 19, at the end of the war against Jesus, that when Jesus comes back, there's 2 that are cast alive into the lake of fire. One of them is the beast, and one of them is the false prophets. Very good. So this is saying plural false prophets will come and they'll perform signs and wonders, but we know the second beast is that false prophet that's thrown into the lake of fire. And what it says that he does in chapter 13, but it also says it again in 19, is he performs those signs and wonders in the presence of the first beast to turn people to worship the beast, right? And he causes the image of the beast to speak and call people out if they're not worshiping, so that they'd be killed. Pretty major stuff. So when people are looking for signs all the time, and when they're wowed by someone who seems to be able to perform miracles and signs, understand, they may not be of God.
Right.
Satan's workers are going to be able to do some of this stuff. So they got to be careful of what they're looking for, what they're following, when they're not usually following what the Word of God says clearly. But it says, for false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Okay? So they're going to mislead, if it were possible. That's how compelling, that's how deceiving, that's how misleading their signs and wonders are going to be during that time. And then it says in verse 26 a similar thing. If therefore they say to you, he's in the wilderness, what does it say? Yeah, don't go forth.
Do not believe them.
Right. Don't go forth and don't believe. Don't believe him and don't go forth. Don't go running after that. Because what does he say next in verse 27?
It's going to happen quickly.
It's going to be quick, and it says, as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, right? Have you ever seen cloud-to-cloud lightning? So a lot of times we see the cloud-to-ground lightning, but cloud-to-cloud lightning would be more of that horizontal. How fast does it happen? Yeah, a lot of times you see a flash. You don't really even see it. Like you have to turn your head. It's that fast, right?
Or it's like you saw it and then you go like.
Yes. Or you see somebody else's reaction, or you see it reflected on your wall even, right. You don't even always see it, it's that fast. But it's evident, it's bright, it has a result usually of loud if there's the thunder that follows, but the lightning itself is not. And then, anyway, so he's saying, for just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. So we're going to look also at the coming, we're going to have room, of the Son of Man. Okay. He's saying it's going to be fast. Now he's just said for. For is a concluding word. He's saying, right before that, people are going to come and say, here is the Christ. And he says, don't believe him. And then he says, they're going to say he's in the wilderness. And he's going to say, don't go forth. For, in other words, because, listen to me, because just like the lightning flashes from the east to the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. You're going to know. It's going to be evident. Might be brief and flashy and fast, but you're going to know, right? Don't be misled by people saying he's over here, he's over there. Okay? It's understandable that in advance they need to be told these things because they could have been misled had they not known. Then he starts talking about it. Well, the next statement, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Did that go on your list of questions? Yeah. Okay. Because sometimes you just kind of like get stopped in your tracks. But what do we know about vultures and corpses? What's the relationship?
Corpse is dead, and a vulture eats dead things.
Right. Okay. So where a corpse is, the vultures will gather. So really, that's just like, okay, it's like saying, sun rises every day. It's just a statement we all get, right? But if you see vultures, what do you know?
Something's dead.
There's a dead body. I had somebody telling me yesterday, she lives in Kahiti, and twice now, they have an empty lot area near their house, and this is the second time, not recently, but this one is recent, of something stinking, and they realize there's a dead deer. That's a big corpse. And they've seen the vulture, buzzards, whatever, come, and we were discussing it, and I thought of this verse, and I thought, you can be sitting outside and you start seeing birds circle, and what do you think? Something's dead. You're driving down the road and you see the big old black ugly things, birds, on the side of the road. There's some roadkill. They're doing their job, by the way, right? Glad that I don't have to do that job, right? Okay, but what also is it saying? That's all evident, that's all we know. I mean, things that we know. Where you see vultures, you know there's a dead body, right? But Jesus is relating this to the coming of the Son of Man, right? What's that?
Some kind of war.
Could be dead bodies, there's going to be a war. Or just like he said about the lightning. He's not saying there's going to be lightning and I'm going to come. He's going to see lightning that fast, that evident, that obvious. He's saying it's obvious there's a corpse if there's vultures, right? Okay, so he's saying my coming is going to be obvious. That's one of the things he's saying here. One thing leads to another. One thing points to another. Remember, they asked him about a sign. What do signs do? Point you to something. Right. Okay. So then he goes on and he says in verse 29, but, what?
Immediately.
Okay. So it's immediately,
After the tribulation.
After-
This will happen.
The tribulation. This is gonna happen. When is it gonna happen? Immediately after the tribulation. Okay? Now, we'll put some things together in a minute. Okay. What's gonna happen immediately after the tribulation? What are the events? You got sun darkened. What else?
Moon will not
light.
So the moon is also darkened.
Stars will fall.
Stars fall. Okay. If we're talking about the sun darkened, the moon not giving its light, and stars falling, what is that telling you is going to be going on? What are we going to notice? Sky's different. Stars falling we're gonna see that where it's gonna impact us, right? But sun darkened, what's that gonna cause the moon? The moon's not gonna have any light, because the moon's light source is the sun. The moon doesn't have its own light, its own light source. It reflects the light of the sun. So if the sun's darkened, the moon's gonna be darkened. What's gonna happen to our day and night? They're gonna be darkened. Right? And stars falling, that'd be another source of light. Very little, but another source of light. Some of the stars are going, it doesn't say all of them, it just says some of the stars are going to fall, right? Or it says, and the stars will fall from the sky. And the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Will anything happening outside of us in our planetary system, in our universe, impact the world? Yeah. It'll impact us and we'll notice it, right? Okay. So these things are going to happen. It doesn't say kind of like, sort of like he said about lightning, or like he said about the vultures and the corpse. He's saying the sun will be darkened, the moon will have no light, and stars will fall from the sky, and the heavens, powers of heavens will be shaken. You can write that down too. And then he says, and then, right? Then what? You have the signs. The sign of the coming, right? Of the Son of Man. Or the sign, sorry, of the Son of Man will appear, not the sign of the coming. The sign of the sun. Where will it appear?
In the sky.
In this dark sky. There, go back to your flash of lightning. If it's really, 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 really dark, and there's some sort of, whether it is really lightning or not, that flash of lightning, if it was, would really show up, wouldn't it? It says, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and
Tribes of the earth will mourn.
tribes of earth, tribes mourn. What does mourning indicate? Death or grieving, right? So why would the tribes of the earth mourn when the sign of the Son of Man is in the sky?
Didn't accept it.
They didn't accept him, right? So now they're going to acknowledge on some level the truth, right? That he is the truth. Then it says they're going to mourn, and what? They will see the Son of Man. So now we've had the sign, and now they're going to see the Son of Man coming.
Coming on the clouds.
Right. He's going to come on clouds with glory, right? With great glory. With power and great glory. He's also going to do what? Send forth his angels.
With a great trumpet.
With a great trumpet. And what are they going to do?
Gather the elect.
Gather the elect. Okay. I'm going to have to put some of this over here. So they're going to gather the elect. Where are they going to gather them from? From the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Okay, so they're going to gather the elect from the four winds. They're not gathering the elect from the sky. The angels are coming from the sky. They're going to gather the elect from the four winds. What does that indicate? I mean, the four winds gathering the elect. What is that?
From the earth.
All over it, right? Yes, from the earth. They're going to gather them from the earth, but from all parts they're going to gather them. And then it says, now from verse 32 on, it's not talking about events. It's talking about the events, if that makes sense. It's not listing more events. It's kind of talking about them. But we have the abomination of desolation that brings in the great tribulation. At the end of the great tribulation, you have the coming of the Son of Man. Right? Okay. So when Jesus is asked the question, what is the sign of your coming? He's finally told us the sign of his coming. And of the end of the age, what is indicating the end of the age? What is the event that brings about the end of the age? The coming of the Son of Man. That's the end of the age. Is it the end of everything? No, but it's the end of the age. That's important. Okay. Now, the rest of this is talking about learn from the parable of the fig tree. When the branch has already become tender, it puts forth leaves, and what do you know is coming? Summer's near. What does that tell you?
Sunshine.
Yes.
Warm.
In relation to these events that he's telling them about, he's saying learn from the parable. What do we learn?
It's near.
That it's times are near, and you can know it because there's going to be evidences, right? Like with a fig tree, when the branch is tender, not stiff like it is in winter, or already dead and needs to be cut off, but when it gets that greenness and that bendability, right? And then the leaves start popping forth, we know we're in spring, which means summer's coming, right?
Something to look forward to.
Yes, yes. I love that he referred to summer, not winter. Because right now we're transitioning over, and today is going to be our first day for a while, really a pattern of 60s or 50s in the daytimes. What's that telling us? And I grieve. Not everybody does, but I do. I like the cooler temps, but not what it's indicating. Because it means that fall means winter's coming. Right? And I don't, it's so in a very similar way. He says, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near right at the door. The rest of the chapter is basically a warning, right? Of, I'm coming, the time is near, and what are they supposed to be acting like? Watching, being careful, right? It even talks about, he even refers to the time before his coming as like a man who knows a thief's going to break into his house. I mean, if I were telling you about a good event coming, I don't think I'd use a negative analogy, but there's good and bad in his coming, in the world's view of things. God's view of things, it's all good. But, right? They need to be careful, they need to be warned, they need to be on alert. Isn't that one of the things he tells them? To be on alert. If you're going to add to this, I'll have to put it up here, but be on alert. Because you don't know what?
When the time,
You don't know the time. Who knows the time, Jesus says?
the Father.
Only the Father. Not even Jesus that's telling them this, God himself doesn't know the day or the hour. Only the Father. There's a wonderful picture of that in the way the Jewish weddings were, or Jewish marriages came about. And you see it in Jesus, there's different parables that Jesus teaches, but it's also, the teaching I've had at times about it is the father would be raising the son to the point where someday he would be ready to get married, right? I mean, that's part of our goal as a parent. And that at some point they would have gone to the prospective bride and her family, and they would have proposed the idea of marriage. They would have entered a marriage contract, okay? But then they would have left and they would have gone home, and she stayed with her family, and what was she doing? Preparing for marriage. What were some of her preparations?
Learning to cook.
Learning to cook, okay? Is that what you said too, Cindy?
Sewing.
Sewing what? What would she be sewing?
Her dress.
Possibly her dress, her clothing for when she left, but also could be linens for her home, sheets and things like that.
Chest.
Yes, she'd have what we saw later as a hope chest, right? She would be, and she would be keeping herself, wouldn't she? She'd be keeping herself pure, spotless, right? Okay. We also have the parable of the brides, remember, and some had their wicks and their oil and some didn't. They weren't prepared and they were left outside. So you see a lot of pictures of preparation. So the bride would be in her home still, getting prepared. She wouldn't know when. It's not the way we do things now. With American weddings, it's the bride's family that prepares the wedding, right? For the wedding. That's not how it happened. The groom would have been going home with his dad, and they would have been preparing a place for her. Are those familiar words? Jesus says, I go, and if I go to prepare a place for you. And when I go, you know I will return. Didn't he say that? Where did Jesus go when he was talking about that? Where did he go? Heaven. After the resurrection, that was the ascension. I go to prepare. So he was telling those that were listening, but all of us, I'm coming back. What is he coming back for? His bride. And he's gone to prepare a place for you. He also told them in another place, he says, where I am in my Father's house, there are many houses, many mansions or many houses, could be many rooms. So we all have that place. That's what he's going to prepare for us. It's an awesome picture. So at some point in time, the groom would be preparing and be preparing. Well, do you think he had some indication of when it was getting close to time? He would have some indication, right? He would know the house was built. He would know that it was furnished. He would know that if he had a job that could provide a living for this girl, right? He would know those things, right? But he didn't know the day or the hour. That's how they did it. And so one day, Dad would say, it's time. And what would they do? They would go to where the bride was. They would start at the outskirts of the city. They would, by the time they got to her house, there would be a parade essentially behind them of people following along. She might hear in advance and look out the window and see him coming. I'm getting goosebumps. And see him coming. She would know, and she could rush downstairs with her lamp and her oil and her clothing and whatever else, any picture you want to put in that. And they would leave together and go back to the place he had prepared for her. And there would be what's called a huppah, or a tent, that they would enter in part of the wedding ceremony. There's not necessarily the idea of a big, elaborate thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars being spent on 15 minutes of words being spoken. But if you see even the picture of Rebecca being brought to Isaac, she gets off the horse, or I think it's a horse or a camel. She gets off and she unveils her face and she walks in the tent with him. That's it. She goes into his mother's tent. She goes into where he has prepared a place. Muzzle top. And when they go into the tent, they would stay in the tent and consummate the wet marriage, and they would usually stay for 7 days. At the end of 7 days, all the people that had gathered, those who were invited to the marriage feast, does that remind you of part of Revelation? Were waiting. They probably were already eating and stuff because it would be a long feast. And they would leave the tent and go out and be a part of those who came and to celebrate the wedding. It's kind of like our reception now, like we have. We just do it in a very more condensed, inexpensive thing. But they would, okay, so you see this idea of Jesus, the Son, telling him in advance, I go. I've proposed to you. You're my bride. We're in a marriage contract. And some of us had to come along later to be part of that bride. But he's gone, and he's preparing a place for us. So when he comes, he's coming, and it's going to be big. It's going to be awesome. And we're going to go with him. And we're going to be his bride. The marriage is going to happen. That's what we heard about in Revelation 19. The marriage is going to happen. There's a betrothal, there is a bride, there are parts and people involved, and then there's actually the marriage, and then there's the marriage supper. It's a totally different event. Separate events, tied together. Jesus is saying, I'm the Son and I don't know. But he's going to have some idea. He's going to have some indication as the son or the groom in the ceremony, as we're seeing this picture. And he's telling them here, you don't know when that day or hour is going to be. But are they going to have some indication? Would the bride have some idea about how long it would take? Maybe they live in the same town and she has some idea if the house is ready yet, right? Or has he gotten to the point where he's picking out curtains and furniture? She's going to hear some things. And they're told. He relates it to what event that has happened historically. Noah, right? Yet another event that's controversial, right? Right? Did the flood happen? Yes, Jesus just confirmed it. It's wonderful when he does that for us. We didn't have any doubts, but it's wonderful. If there was any doubt, it happened. But he says, in the days of Noah. So let's just momentarily think about in the days of Noah. What led up to the flood? What events? What was going on in the world?
What's going on?
Pretty much what's going on now, right? Life was going on now, but it had degenerated into very unrighteous living, riotous living, right? Okay, but what was Noah doing visually? Building.
Huge.
Right. That if you didn't even see it, you knew about it, right? This huge boat with no trailer. We have lakes around here, right?
No water.
There's no water nearby. He's not building it in the water or on a dock or where it could be lowered.
And what is rain?
Yeah, what is rain? Because they hadn't seen it. And how long did he preach? Do you know? 120 years. Do you think they believed him at the end of the 120?
No.
Apparently not, because none of them got in the boat. Do you think during 120 years, God would have allowed them to have repented and come to him? Yeah, he would have. I've been told by people who know this, there was enough space in the ark to take one of each kind of animal, or not one, but every character, every two, and then so many more of the clean. But all the animals that were told to be taken on, there was enough room to have taken tons of people. So even in this big boat, God provided space for anyone that would have come to him.
They just went about their daily lives.
Went about their daily lives. That's part of this, right? Eating, drinking, giving in marriage, and all of that, right? Just living life. Just like we're doing right now. Not bad, because while we remain, we're supposed to be living our life. We're not supposed to go up on a hill and, just look to the sky always. Or like I even said earlier, it'd be great if I just spent all my time in the Word of God and on my knees, but seriously, you can't do that. And God wants us to, I won't be relating to other people if all I'm doing is holding up somewhere. I'm supposed to be talking to people and sharing God to them. So that's the picture here. But that's the idea of, let's just go a little bit further. At some point, Noah and the family got on the boat. And after that, God closed the door. Okay? People could have seen all that. And this says, until the flood came and swept them away, they did not believe. They did not understand. It's too late then. That's what it's going to be like in the coming of the Son of Man. People are going to be living life. They're going to have all the warnings. They've got this right now for centuries, for thousands of years. They've got this word. We are to be telling them, though. Doesn't matter if they believe us or not, we're to be telling them. And when the events of Revelation began to take place and unfold, like I said, there's nothing to prevent anything from starting prophetically. There's no event that has to happen to prevent that's stopping anything or has to happen before. It could happen in my next breath. And that's how we should be living. Okay? With that expectation. But once it starts, once some of these events start, once that first seal is broken, let's just put it that way, the rest unfolds in time, exactly how God has said it's going to. Once they get to that midpoint that we were talking about earlier, or that pivotal point, that end of the sixth trumpet, beginning of the seventh trumpet point, when the two witnesses are killed, that's an event. When the woman has to flee to the wilderness, that's what happens. That's the separation of those time frames. What does this say? Abomination of desolation, flee. Can you imagine the abomination of desolation is tied to that point? Yeah. So from the time she flees into the wilderness would fit during this time when Judea is to flee into the mountains. Tribulation, great tribulation. We've seen great tribulation mentioned in the book of Revelation. And then it's going to end with, that part is going to end with the coming of the Son of Man. So that last part has time in it, doesn't it? We can sum it up as 3.5 years. So from the time of the end of the 6th trumpet, beginning of the 7th trumpet, that third woe, the war in heaven, Satan coming down to earth, all of those events that line up completely, is only 3.5 years until the coming of the Son of Man. But they still don't know the day or the hour. But they will know. Things are going to progress. And it's going to be a tribulation like no one has ever seen before. And if those days had not been cut short, no one would be saved through it. Pretty amazing.
Now 40. Now line 40. There will be 2 men.
There'll be 2 men in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding and one will be taken and one will be left. What do you think that means? Okay, you have question marks, one of your questions. Good. Okay. When you hear this particular passage preached, if you've ever heard it preached, what are they usually talking about?
The first coming, the rapture.
The rapture. Right, what we call the rapture, which we haven't discussed or set down and forth in yet. And we will. But is that what this time frame is talking about?
No.
It's talking about the coming of the Son of Man in the end. So this is one of those passages that when you study it, you realize if pastors are preaching rapture from this, they're not preaching it correctly. It's sad. And I've heard it too. I've absolutely. Do you remember? Okay, I've got on my, said, not rapture. I've got that in my margin. It's not the rapture. One will be taken and one will be left. 2 women grinding at the mill. One will be taken, one will be left. These are warnings, right? When you think about the context of what Jesus is talking about in the days of Noah, who was taken and who was left? Who was left? Noah and his family. Who was taken? All the bad people, right? So if he's talking about the days of Noah and it'll be like this, and then he says one will be taken and one will be left, who's taken?
Believers.
I put unrighteous, and who's left? The righteous, right? The angels are coming with Jesus and they're gathering the elect, right? On the earth. That's the righteous being gathered, right? Do you remember in the book of Revelation in chapter 14, I think it is, where you've got the angel and the angel and the angel and the angel. The first one is the angel finding him in heaven with the eternal gospel. At the end, there's an angel that comes out of the temple and tells the one who's like a son of man with a sickle, and he's to gather the grapes of the vine. Gather by the angels. And then you've got the second angel with a sickle who's told to gather, I'm sorry, not the grapes, he was to gather the harvest. The second angel with a sickle is told by another angel, gather the grapes for the winepress of the wrath of God. That's similar to this. So put that in there.
So is that kind of like this, because of the sake of the elect? I mean, these people are the good ones that are left?
There are some elect. Yes, there are some good ones left. Yes. Even though if the days hadn't been cut short, there would be no one saved, right? But then it also says over here, when we're talking about kind of the overview, and then these are more details, that's what you're seeing here, is those who endure to the end will be saved. So the elect that endure to the end will be saved. And we'll look at that further with other scripture passages that'll just really nail that down in time. But you're starting to see those things. Starting to put them in your questions or put them over to, not that you necessarily can't understand it at all, but you don't know exactly where it fits or what exactly that means. And then it talks about the good slave found doing good work and putting in charge of other things, and the bad slave that's found doing evil and what happens to him. And Jesus has many parables about that through scripture. But this is the culmination or the end. So when Jesus is asked the questions, when will these things be? When will the stones be left, not be left upon another? Does he answer that question? No. But he does give them an overview of everything to the end. Then he's, in the next part, pretty much answers, what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And he answers that one better. So in Matthew 24, he doesn't answer the first question of when will these, he tells them about it, but he doesn't tell them when the stones will be left on other. That's going to be important when we look at a parallel passage, because you're going to see a difference. Here, he doesn't answer the first question, not specifically. Okay, but he does give them warnings. So, question remains, somewhat rhetorical, but something I want you to think about over and over and again. How are we to be living in light of this?
To be
Like it could be any moment. What'd you say?
As God wants us to.
As God definitely wants us to do. As Jesus lived during his ministry, that would be another. But Jesus during his ministry has given them this message, not should say but, and Jesus has given them this message in those last and final moments that he has in this earthly ministry time frame, talking to them man to man, face to face. It's hugely important what he says, and it needs to be, all of it needs to be listened to. There's an emphasis. There's an underlining, bold, highlighted, arrows pointing down, the whole thing, on anything he says.
That's why he didn't tell us the exact date, because some of us will say, oh, tomorrow I'll
Yes.
be better, or,
I'll clean my act
right,
tomorrow.
and then I'll be saved. And
Right.
Like they
But
say,
right now, I want to live the way I want.
Yeah, and people do live like that now. Yes, Cindy?
oh, that saying, live today like there's no tomorrow, it should really be saying, live today and prepare for tomorrow.
Yes, be on alert, prepare for tomorrow, prepare others if we can, at least be given the message. We have a message to give.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the person that is the most important to you, or 12 people, or whatever number of people that are most important to you. If you had any question, if you could put a little meter on them and know, and had any question or doubt about where they're going to end up, would you be telling them about this? Do you have anybody like that in your life? Like most of the people in my life, right? Tell them about this. We've got to find a way. The words are important. How we approach things are important. It's an offensive message. They're going to be offended. But it's kind of like I think I said last week. I know I've said it this week, maybe not to you guys. But it's not my goal to just take the gay marriage issue that's on everybody's Facebook feed and everywhere else in this country right now because of the Supreme Court decision. It's not for me to walk up to every person or hold some horrible, nasty sign up and say, you're going to hell. But if I were talking to someone, my heart is, with my mind on it, you're going to hell. And I gotta care about that. So it's not about me going and saying, you're a bad person, you're not like me, I would never do what you're doing, how horrible your sin is. By the way, I sin too, but mine aren't that bad. That's not my message. My message needs to be, God says it, it is sin. And the ultimate consequence of that is that you're going to the lake of fire someday. And I don't want that for you. That's reality, folks. That's what our message should be. I love you enough. Even if I don't know you, I love you enough to tell you the truth. We would tell somebody, if a loved one was smoking, we would tell them what that smoking could lead to, right? And that's an earthly consequence. We would tell someone who's standing up on the top of the Empire State Building, balancing off the edge, probably need to dial it back. Because that drop is fatal. We would tell them that, right? And that's temporary problems. Why would we not tell them about their eternal consequences instead? They're not going to like it. They're not going to like you. What does it say? We're going to be hated. The falling away is interesting. Oh, and one question we need to answer. Kay asked the question at least twice. Who do you think his primary audience was? Jews. And why do you believe that? I agree, but why do you believe that?
Because there's a temple.
They were the chosen.
Is that what
They
you?
were the chosen ones.
They're the chosen ones. Sandy said he was at the temple. Okay, when it says those in Judea flee to the mountains, who's he talking about? Israel. When he's talking about on a Sabbath, who would that impact? Not me. It's going to impact Jews, right? Everything about this message is specific to the Jews. And we can learn from it. We can apply it to our lives. We can be careful, but Jesus is speaking primarily, his audience is the Jews. So when he talks about the elect, who's he talking about? Okay, but within that, he is saying they're going to hate you because of my name. So these are genetically Jewish people who are believers. But he's also talking to genetically, I don't know, you know what I mean by that. They're Jewish people. They're tied to Jerusalem. At this point, they're not saved. They might not be saved when some of these events start happening. And I'm going to tell you this, if they're here during this, they weren't saved prior. They might have gotten saved during the process. They might have been part of the 144,000 or heard from the 144,000 or listened to the two witnesses. But they weren't saved prior to our timeline to have been going through. Yes, Andy?
So don't Jewish people, even though they're maybe not totally religious, still have, they don't like people that are completed Jews that have become Christians? I mean,
Right. They're not buying into it right now. The thing that we have a tendency, and sometimes that's the reason I'm making my point, we have a tendency as Gentiles in the church is that we separate ourselves out from genetic Jews, as I'm calling them. And we're Gentile believers, they're Jewish. Okay, now if they're practicing Judaism, if they're practicing their religion, which means they've rejected Christ, they haven't seen him as Messiah, haven't seen Jesus as Messiah, they're not Christians. Now there are some that have the heritage, the genetics of Judaism, being Jewish, that have understood, as you're calling them, completed Jews, Messianic Jews, there's a lot of terms, they're Christians. Paul told us, Jesus told Paul, but Paul told us the mystery of the church that could not be revealed prior, that wasn't revealed to Daniel, for instance, is Jew and Gentile in one body. So Jews can be Christians. We have a tendency to keep them separate in our minds. And in a sense, I'm not trying to separate them out into Matthew too much, but Jesus is talking to Jews when he's saying these things. These are going to be events that occur and impact their city, Jerusalem, their area, Judea. They're going to have to flee. They're going to have to run. They're going to be pursued. They're going to be... If many fall away, what does that mean they've had to come to? They've had to come to that belief system, and people